You can't fix what you don't understand. The voice came from behind the line of engineers, low and steady, almost lost beneath the hum of generators and the dry rattle of desert wind sweeping across the tarmac. And for a moment no one turned because no one expected anything worth hearing to come from a man who looked like he had stepped out of another decade. But the M1 Abrams in front of them didn't care about expectations. It sat dead in the heat. 68 tons of silent steel under a harsh mid-afternoon sun, its armor plates radiating waves of heat that blurred the air like a mirage, and around it a dozen engineers in clean uniforms and mirrored sunglasses stood with tablets in hand, their screens glowing green with diagnostics that all said the same thing. Everything was operational. Everything was fine, and yet the engine refused to turn over, refused to even try, as if the machine itself had decided to stop listening. Ethan Cole wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his glove and kicked the lower hull in. Frustration, the dull metallic thud echoing across the concrete. "We've run every check twice," he snapped, his voice tight, sharp, defensive. "Fuel flow is clean, electrical systems are green, the fire control system is synced. There is nothing wrong with this tank." But the silence that followed made the statement feel hollow, because the Abrams still didn't move, still didn't breathe, still didn't respond. And a small cluster of junior soldiers stood a few yards back, watching with that quiet tension that builds when something expensive and important refuses to cooperate. One of them, Private Lucas Reed, shifted his weight and glanced past the engineers toward the edge of the staging area where the old man stood, hands resting loosely at his sides, posture relaxed but not careless, his eyes fixed on the tank with a kind of stillness that didn't match the chaos around it. His jacket was faded, the fabric worn soft with time, and his presence felt out of place among the polished equipment and digital screens, like a piece of history that had wandered into the wrong moment. Ethan followed Lucas's glance and scoffed under his breath, loud enough for the others to hear. "Great. Now we've got an audience," he said, turning just enough to gesture dismissively toward the old man. "Sir, this is a restricted area. We've got a system failure here, not a museum exhibit." A few of the engineers chuckled, the sound brittle, forced, the kind of laughter that tries to cover frustration, but the old man didn't react, didn't defend himself, didn't even look at them. He just kept his gaze on the tank as if listening to something no one else could hear. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint creak of cooling metal and the distant whine of a drone circling overhead, and for a brief second, the noise of the bass seemed to fade around him. Lucas frowned, a subtle unease settling in his chest, because there was something about the way the man stood, the way he watched, that didn't fit the picture Ethan was painting. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't confusion. It was recognition, and before Lucas could stop himself, he took a small step forward, eyes narrowing, as the old man finally moved, slow, deliberate, taking a single step closer to the Abrams, his boots scraping lightly against the concrete. And in that quiet motion there was a weight that made the air feel different, like something long buried had just shifted beneath the surface. The old man stopped just short of the tank, not touching it. Not yet, his head tilted slightly, as if the machine in front of him had said something only he could hear, and the engineers watched with a mix of irritation and disbelief as seconds stretched longer than they should have, the sun pressing down harder, the heat rising off the armor in shimmering waves. Ethan Cole let out a sharp breath and stepped forward, his boots striking the concrete with controlled impatience. "Sir, I am going to have to ask you again to step back," he said, his tone clipped, professional on the surface but edged with something colder underneath. "This is a controlled diagnostic environment." But the words felt rehearsed, like something he was saying more for himself than for the man who had not even acknowledged him. Victor Hale's eyes remained fixed on the Abrams, tracing lines across its surface, the seams between panels, the subtle variations in the metal that no sensor would ever report. And when he finally spoke, his voice did not rise to meet Ethan's authority. It moved beneath it, steady and unhurried. "You ran the startup sequence twice," he said, not asking, stating, and Ethan blinked, caught off guard for half a second before his expression hardened again. "3 times," he corrected, folding his arms, and every system check came back clean. Victor nodded once, almost to himself, as if that confirmed something rather than challenged it. And he took another slow step along the side of the tank, his hand hovering inches from the surface, never making contact, just following the curve of the armor like a memory. Guiding him, Lucas Reed watched closely now, his earlier unease sharpening into focus, because there was a difference between guessing and knowing, and whatever this was, it was not guesswork. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint metallic tick as the tank cooled unevenly under the sun, and Victor paused at a specific section near the engine compartment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You trust the system," he said quietly, still not looking at anyone. "It tells you everything is fine, so you stop looking." Ethan scoffed, a short, humorless sound. "That is because the system is designed to catch faults humans miss," he replied, stepping closer, his voice rising just enough for the others to hear. "This is not some old mechanical rig you can fix with instinct. This is a digital platform with layered redundancies." A few heads nodded behind him, the reassurance of familiar language settling nerves that had been stretched thin. But Victor did not react to the explanation. He simply crouched slightly, his gaze locking onto a narrow panel line that most would have overlooked entirely. And for a moment the noise of the bass seemed to fade again, replaced by something older, something remembered, the faint echo of engines under strain, the weight of heat, the feeling of a machine pushed beyond what it was meant to endure. His fingers twitched once at his side, not reaching, just remembering, and then he straightened slowly, turning his head just enough to glance at Ethan for the first time, his eyes calm, clear, and completely certain. "Your system is not wrong," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "It just does not know what it is looking at." The statement hung in the air, simple, almost quiet, but it cut through the tension sharper than any raised voice. And for a brief second no one spoke, because there was something in the way he said it that made arguing feel like missing the point entirely. Lucas felt it first, that shift, that subtle change in the weight of the moment, and his hand moved instinctively toward his radio, not out of panic, but out of a growing certainty that whatever was happening here was about to matter far more than a stalled engine. Lucas Reed did not realize he was holding his breath until he let it out slowly, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his radio as he watched Victor Hale step back half a pace, creating space between himself and the tank, as if giving it room to speak. And for the first time the silence around the Abrams felt different, no longer just a failure, but a question waiting for the right person to answer it. Ethan Cole shifted his stance, irritation creeping back into his expression as the moment stretched too long for his liking. "All right, that is enough," he said, his voice sharper now, more force behind it. "You have had your look, but we are not guessing our way through a system like this." He gestured toward the open laptops and diagnostic rigs, their screens still glowing with perfect, flawless reports. "We rely on data, not feelings." A few of the engineers murmured in agreement, the familiar comfort of procedure reasserting itself, but Lucas did not move, his eyes still on Victor, because something about the man's stillness was beginning to feel deliberate rather than passive. Victor turned slightly, not fully facing them, just enough that his profile caught the light. The lines on his face deepened by years that seemed to carry more weight than time alone. "Data tells you what is happening," he said quietly. "It does not tell you why." Ethan exhaled through his nose, a tight, controlled sound. "We know why," he replied. "If there was a fault, the system would flag it. That is the entire point." Victor's gaze drifted back to the narrow panel line near the engine compartment, his eyes tracing it again, slower this time, as if confirming something he had already decided. And then he spoke again, softer, almost to himself. "Unless the fault is not where the system is looking." The words hung there, subtle but heavy, and Lucas felt that shift again, stronger now. Like standing on the edge of something he could not yet see. His thumb brushed the side of his radio, hesitation flickering for a fraction of a second before training pushed it aside. He stepped back just enough to avoid drawing attention and turned slightly away, his voice low as he keyed the mic. "Command, this is Private Reed at Test Range Bravo. I need to verify a name." Static crackled briefly before a voice responded, crisp and routine. "Go ahead, Reed." Lucas glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was watching too closely. "Victor Hale," he said, keeping his tone even. "Civilian contractor, possibly prior service." There was a pause on the line, longer than expected, the kind of pause that did not belong to a simple database check. Lucas felt a faint tightening in his chest as the silence stretched. Then the voice came back, different now, slower, more deliberate. Stand by. The channel went quiet, and Lucas lowered the radio slightly, his pulse picking up without a clear reason why. Across the tarmac, Ethan had already turned away from Victor, refocusing on his team, issuing rapid instructions, recalibrating systems that had already been checked twice, the rhythm of control returning to his movements. But Victor did not move. He stood exactly where he was, eyes still on the tank, as if the answer had already been found, and everything else was simply catching up. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint, uneven tick from deep within the Abrams, a sound so subtle it could have been dismissed as normal cooling. But Victor's head tilted just slightly, and in that small motion there was recognition, the kind that does not come from manuals or training modules, but from time spent listening when everything else was too loud to matter. The radio in Lucas Reed's hand crackled again, but this time the sound was sharper, cutting through the dry air with a kind of urgency that did not belong in routine communication. "Reed, confirm again." The voice on the other end said, lower now, controlled but no longer casual. "Did you say Victor Hale?" Lucas swallowed, his throat suddenly dry despite the heat. "Yes, sir," he answered, keeping his tone steady even as something in his chest tightened. "Victor Hale." There was a pause, not empty but heavy, like someone on the other end had just stood up without realizing it. And when the voice returned it carried a different weight entirely. "Hold your position, Reed. Do not interfere with that individual." The line went silent before Lucas could respond, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at the radio as if it might explain itself. Across the tarmac, Ethan Cole had not noticed the change, or if he had, he chose to ignore it. His focus locked on regaining control of a situation that had slipped just enough to unsettle him. "Run the sequence again," he ordered, sharper now, his team moving quickly, fingers tapping across screens, cables being checked, confirmations spoken in clipped, practiced tones. The engine remained silent, the tank unmoved, and the repetition began to feel less like problem-solving and more like insistence, like trying to force reality to match expectation. Victor Hale exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and for the first time he moved his hand forward, not touching the tank, just letting his fingers hover inches from the metal near the engine housing. His eyes half narrowed, listening. The faint ticking sound from within shifted, uneven, subtle, something that would have been dismissed by anyone focused on data instead of instinct. And in that moment the world around him seemed to fade, not disappearing but receding. The sharp edges of the present softening into something older, the hum of generators blending into a memory of engines under strain, the dry heat of the tarmac giving way to a heavier air, thick with dust and tension. He saw it not as a vision, but as a recall so precise it felt immediate. A tank pushed beyond its limits, systems reading normal, while something deeper failed quietly, unseen. The kind of failure that did not announce itself until it was too late unless someone knew where to listen. His fingers twitched once, remembering tools worn smooth from use, adjustments made by feel rather than measurement. And then the present snapped back into focus as the ticking sound settled into a pattern only he seemed to recognize. Victor straightened slightly, his gaze locking onto that narrow panel line again. And this time there was no hesitation in his voice. "It is binding," he said, calm, certain, as if stating something obvious. Ethan turned sharply, frustration flaring. "Nothing is binding," he shot back, gesturing toward the diagnostics. "If there was resistance, we would see it." Victor shook his head once, not dismissive, just definitive. "Not there," he replied, and he pointed, not dramatically, just a small, precise motion toward the exact section he had been watching. "There." The word landed quietly, but it shifted something in the air. Lucas felt it again, stronger now, and his grip tightened on the radio, because whatever was happening here was no longer just a disagreement between a civilian and an engineer. It was the moment right before something broke, or something was finally understood. The words settled into the heat like a stone dropped into still water, small but impossible to ignore. And for a moment no one moved because no one was quite sure how to respond to something that simple. Ethan Cole let out a short breath that almost turned into a laugh, but stopped halfway. The sound dry, strained, binding. He repeated, shaking his head slightly, as if the idea itself was outdated. This is not a manual linkage system. There is nothing in there that just binds without triggering. A fault. His hand came up, gesturing toward the tank with controlled precision. Everything is monitored, every tolerance accounted for. But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked briefly toward the panel Victor had indicated, just for a second, just enough to betray that the certainty was not as solid as it had been minutes ago. Victor did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply stepped closer, closing the distance by a single pace. And this time his hand did touch the tank, his fingers, resting lightly against the warm metal, and the contact was not mechanical. It was familiar, like greeting something he had known long before it had become this version of itself. The heat seeped into his skin, carrying with it that faint, uneven rhythm, the subtle resistance hidden beneath layers of perfect readings. And the moment his fingers settled there, the present shifted again, not fully disappearing but thinning at the edges, the hum of the bass fading into something deeper, heavier. The memory rising not as a story but as a sensation, a machine under stress, systems reporting green, while something essential began to seize just out of sight. He remembered the weight of time pressing down. The need to act before a silent failure became something irreversible, and more than that he remembered the lesson that had been learned the hard way, that the most dangerous problems were the ones that convinced you they did not exist. His thumb moved slightly along the edge of the panel, feeling a difference no sensor would register, a fraction of misalignment, a resistance that should not have been there, and then the memory receded, leaving only the certainty behind. Victor pulled his hand back and looked at the panel as if it had just confirmed what he already knew. It is not the system, he said quietly. It is the pressure behind it. Ethan stepped forward. Immediately, the last of his patience thinning. You are talking in circles, he said, sharper now. If there was pressure, it would show in the readings. Victor met his gaze fully this time. Calm, unwavering. Only if you are measuring the right thing. The answer came without hesitation, and for a brief second Ethan had no response ready. Because the statement did not attack his knowledge, it bypassed it entirely. Lucas felt that shift again, stronger than before, and this time it was not just unease. It was recognition that the situation had moved beyond routine. He raised the radio again, about to speak, when the channel came alive on its own. The voice on the other end no longer routine, no longer distant, but immediate and direct. All personnel at Test Range Bravo, stand by for incoming command. The words cut through the air with a clarity that froze movement before anyone consciously decided to stop. Ethan turned instinctively toward the sound, confusion flickering across his face. While Victor did not react at all, he simply stood there, eyes still on the tank, as if whatever was about to happen next had already been accounted for. The words from the radio did not fade after they were spoken. They lingered in the air like a pressure change, subtle but undeniable, and across the tarmac movement slowed without anyone giving the order. Technicians paused mid-action, hands hovering over keyboards and panels, conversations cut off before they finished, and even the steady background noise of the bass seemed to pull back just enough to make space for whatever was coming next. Ethan Cole turned fully now, his earlier confidence replaced by something tighter, more controlled, as if he was trying to reassert authority over a situation that was no longer entirely his. Stand by for what? He muttered under his breath, but no one answered. Because no one knew, Lucas Reed lowered his radio slightly, his pulse steady but elevated, the message he had sent already echoing in the back of his mind. And for the first time since this began, he realized that the name he had spoken had not just been recognized, it had been escalated, the kind of escalation that did not happen unless someone higher up had a reason to care. Victor Hale remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his attention still anchored to the tank as if everything else around him was secondary. The faint ticking from within the Abrams continued, uneven, restrained, a quiet insistence that something was not right beneath the layers of perfect diagnostics. The heat pressed down harder now, the sun reflecting off the armor in sharp flashes of light that forced the eyes to squint, and in that brightness Victor's expression remained steady, untroubled, as if time was moving differently for him than it was for everyone else. In the distance a low, mechanical sound began to rise, at first barely noticeable, blending into the background hum of the bass. But then it grew, distinct, the approach of a vehicle moving with purpose, not fast but direct, and heads began to turn toward the sound almost in unison. Ethan followed the movement, his jaw tightening slightly as he recognized the pattern. This was not routine traffic. This was command presence. And that realization landed heavier than any explanation could have. The vehicle came into view at the edge of the staging area, a dark staff transport cutting across the concrete with controlled speed, dust trailing lightly behind it. And as it slowed, the air around the Abrams shifted again, the tension tightening into something sharper, more focused, the kind of moment where everything that happens next matters more than what came before. Lucas felt it fully now. The weight of being at the center of something he did not yet understand. His earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet certainty that whatever Victor Hale had seen in that tank had already reached beyond this tarmac. The vehicle came to a stop, the engine idling low, and for a brief second no one moved. Not the engineers, not the soldiers, not even Ethan. Because the arrival itself was enough to change the rules of the moment, and through it all Victor did not look up. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge the presence behind him. His focus remained fixed on the narrow panel he had identified, as if the answer still lived there, waiting to be revealed, and everything else, rank, authority, expectation, would have to wait its turn. The engine of the staff vehicle cut off with a low, final hum that seemed louder than it should have been, and for a moment the entire staging area held its breath, the heat pressing down, the air still, every eye drawn toward the door before it even opened. And when it did, the movement was deliberate, controlled, not rushed, but carrying a weight that shifted the atmosphere instantly. Colonel Robert Vance stepped out onto the concrete with the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself, his uniform crisp, his posture exact. But it was not the rank that changed the moment. It was the way he stopped immediately after exiting, his gaze already searching, already locked onto something before anyone had the chance to speak. Ethan Cole straightened instinctively, his earlier irritation snapping into rigid professionalism. "Colonel," he called out, stepping forward, ready to explain, to justify, to regain control of the narrative before it slipped further away. "We are experiencing a system inconsistency. Diagnostics are reading. Where is he?" Vance cut in, not raising his voice, not needing to. The interruption clean, precise, and final. Ethan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the question not matching what he expected. "Sir," he began again, trying to redirect. "The issue is within the engine subsystem. We are isolating. Where is Victor Hale?" The colonel said, and this time the name landed with weight. Not curiosity, not uncertainty, but recognition, and the effect was immediate. Conversation stopped completely. The last bits of movement froze in place, and Ethan's words fell away unfinished, because whatever explanation he had prepared no longer mattered. Lucas Reed felt it fully now, that shift becoming something undeniable, his grip on the radio tightening slightly as he watched the colonel step forward without waiting for permission, without waiting for direction, his path already set, and across the tarmac Victor Hale finally moved, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge the presence approaching him, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if this moment had been expected long before it arrived. Vance closed the distance quickly, his steps measured but direct, and when he stopped in front of Victor there was a brief pause, a silence that carried more weight than any command. The colonel's eyes studied him, not scanning, not questioning, but confirming, and then something subtle shifted in his posture. A fraction of tension released, a recognition settling into certainty. "We thought you were gone," Vance said, his voice lower now, not for the crowd but for the man in front of him, and Victor's response was simple, almost quiet. "Not yet." The exchange lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. Ethan stood a few feet away, caught between confusion and realization, because the dynamic he understood had just been replaced by something he did not. The colonel did not turn to him, did not ask for a report, did not request data. Instead, he stepped slightly to the side, his attention shifting to the tank, then back to Victor. "What do you need?" he asked, direct, immediate, and without hesitation. and for the first time. Since this began, the question was not about procedure. It was about trust. Victor glanced once more at the narrow panel he had identified, the faint ticking from within still uneven, still restrained. And then he answered, calm, certain, as if the solution had been waiting all along. 10 seconds, he said, and the words settled into the silence with a weight that no one dared challenge. The number did not sound impressive when spoken. 10 seconds. It was almost dismissible, something that could be laughed off under normal circumstances. But nothing about this moment was normal, and no one laughed. Not Ethan Cole, not the engineers, not the soldiers standing along the edge of the tarmac, because the way Victor Hale said it carried no uncertainty, no guesswork, just quiet finality. Colonel Vance gave a single nod, sharp and immediate. You have it, he said, and then, without raising his voice, without any visible force, he added, everyone stand down. The effect was instant. Conversations died completely. Hands dropped from controls. Even Ethan hesitated before stepping back. The structure he relied on shifting beneath him as authority moved past him without resistance. Victor did not acknowledge any of it. He had already turned back toward the tank, his focus narrowing once more to that single point, that narrow panel line that had been invisible to everyone else. The heat pressed against him as he stepped closer, the surface of the armor warm beneath the sun. And this time there was no pause, no observation phase. The decision had already been made. His hand moved to the edge of the panel, fingers finding a small latch that blended almost seamlessly into the design, something that required familiarity to even notice, and with a precise motion he released it. The panel shifting open just enough to reveal the hidden space behind it. The movement was quiet, controlled, nothing dramatic. But every eye was locked onto it as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. Inside, the components looked perfect, clean, aligned, exactly as the diagnostics had reported, but Victor's gaze went past the surface, deeper, searching for what could not be displayed on any screen. His hand moved again, reaching in with careful precision, and for a brief second the world seemed to hold still. No wind, no noise, just the faint ticking from within the machine. And then his fingers found it, a slight resistance, a pressure point that did not belong, subtle enough to pass every system check, but real enough to stop everything. He adjusted it, not with force, not with tools, just a small, controlled correction, a fraction of movement that most would have dismissed as insignificant. And then he withdrew his hand, closed the panel, and stepped back. The entire action taking less time than anyone expected, less time than it had taken for the engineers to argue about it. And when he was done, he did not explain, did not justify. He simply looked at the tank and said, calm, certain, try it. The word hung there for a moment, and no one moved, because the simplicity of it felt almost impossible after everything that had happened, until Colonel Vance turned his head slightly toward Ethan, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. Do it. And this time there was no hesitation. Ethan moved, quickly now, stepping into position, his hands moving over the controls with practiced precision. And for a brief second, everything was silent again, the kind of silence that exists right before something changes. And then the tank responded, not loudly at first, but unmistakably, a low, rising hum from deep within its frame, the kind of sound that had been missing all along. And in that moment, the entire tarmac seemed to freeze, not because of the noise, but because of what it meant. And no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. The sound did not rise into a roar. It built slowly, steadily, a deep mechanical hum that settled into the bones before it reached the ears. And as the engine came to life, the entire tank seemed to shift from something inert into something awake, the faint vibration rolling outward across the concrete beneath it, subtle but undeniable. And for a moment no one moved because they were not reacting to the machine. They were reacting to the fact that it had been silent just seconds before. Ethan Cole's hands remained on the controls, frozen in place as the system indicators updated in front of him, green lights still present, but now finally aligned with reality. His eyes flicked across the display, searching for the explanation that would justify what had just happened. But there was none, no fault log, no warning, no recorded anomaly, just a system that now worked as if it had never failed at all. And that absence hit harder than any error message could have. he slowly stepped back. From the console, his earlier certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, something more difficult to define. Across from him the engineers stood in silence, their tablets lowered, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and reluctant understanding, because what they had just witnessed did not fit into the framework they trusted. Lucas Reed exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath again, his gaze shifting from the tank to Victor Hale, and in that moment the difference between knowing and understanding became clear. The machine had been fixed, but that was not what held the weight of the moment. What mattered was how it had been fixed, with no tools, no diagnostics, no process, just recognition and precision. Colonel Vance watched it all without surprise, his posture steady, his eyes moving once from the tank back to Victor. And there was something in that look that was not authority but respect, the kind that is not given lightly and never given by mistake. "Thank you," he said, simple, direct, and without ceremony. Victor gave a small nod, nothing more, as if the outcome had been expected all along, as if the result mattered less than the act itself. The wind moved again across the tarmac, carrying the low, steady hum of the engine outward, blending it into the background of the base where it now belonged, where it should have been from the beginning. Ethan took a step forward, then stopped, words forming and fading before they could be spoken, because whatever question he had no longer felt appropriate. The answer had already been given in a way that did not require explanation. Victor turned slightly, his attention leaving the tank, for the first time since it had come back to life. And as he stepped away there was no announcement, no acknowledgement from him. Just a quiet exit from a moment that had shifted everyone else. Lucas watched him go, the weight of what he had witnessed settling deeper with each step, and behind him the Abrams continued to run, steady, reliable, exactly as it was designed to be, as if it had never faltered at all. And in the silence that followed, no one rushed to speak, because some moments did not need to be filled. They needed to be understood, and respect, once earned, did not need to be demanded. It simply remained.